Oklahoma still holds elections. But who are its leaders really representing? When most races are effectively decided in low-turnout primaries, organized interests can matter more than the general electorate. By William Langdon. When I moved to Oklahoma in 1978, Democrats controlled the governor's office and both chambers of the legislature. Rural Democratic lawmakers wielded enormous influence. In many communities, the Democratic primary was the election that mattered most, while the general election often became little more than a formality. Today, the party labels have changed. Republicans control the governor's office, the Oklahoma House, and the Oklahoma Senate. In many districts, the Republican primary determines who will hold office long before the broader electorate votes in November. The old system had serious problems, and the current one does too. The common denominator is not whether Democrats or Republicans hold power. It is what happens when one party controls state government for so long that winning a low-turnout primary becomes more important than representing the public. In Oklahoma's June 2026 primary, approximately 26% of registered voters participated. That election helped determine the candidates for governor, Congress, the legislature, and other offices. Nearly 3 out of 4 registered Oklahomans did not participate. When an election that determines realistic contenders for public office is decided by 1/4 of the electorate, the preferences of everyone else are largely absent from the outcome. Participation in the Republican governor's primary reached approximately 31% of registered Republicans. Participation in the Democratic governor's primary was approximately 28% of registered Democrats. In a state where the Republican nominee frequently becomes the general election favorite, those percentages carry consequences beyond either party. Before the June primary, Oklahoma had approximately 2,400,000 registered voters. About 1,300,000 were Republicans. Approximately 614,000 were Democrats, and roughly 495,000 were independents. The Republican governor's primary was closed to everyone except registered Republicans. Democrats and independents could not participate in the contest that was most likely to determine Oklahoma's next governor. Legal eligibility to vote in November does not change who controls the decisive nomination. If approximately 31% of the state's 1,300,000 registered Republicans voted, about 400,000 people participated. That represents roughly 17% of all registered Oklahoma voters. Fewer than 1 in 5 registered voters helped narrow the field in the election most likely to determine the next governor. After the primary, House Speaker Kyle Hilbert described the results as a resounding message supporting the work of House Republicans. But an election in which approximately 74% of registered voters did not participate cannot credibly be treated as a comprehensive mandate from the people of Oklahoma. The primary results tell us what participating voters decided. They do not prove that most Oklahomans endorse every business subsidy, tax credit, education policy, or legislative priority supported by the Republican majority. A party primary can select a nominee, but it cannot automatically convert the preferences of 1/4 of the electorate into a mandate from the entire state. On August 25th, Oklahoma voters will consider 2 proposed constitutional amendments during the statewide runoff election, rather than waiting until the November 3rd general election. Both measures originated in the legislature, and both would give lawmakers substantial authority to make important decisions later. State Question 844 concerns how local schools and governments are reimbursed when manufacturers receive property tax exemptions. State Question 846 concerns voter identification and the legislature's authority to determine the specific rules governing proof of identity. Legislatively referred constitutional amendments ordinarily appear on the November general election ballot. Moving these proposals to August required additional legislative action. Both chambers approved a special provision placing the voter identification proposal on the August ballot, and both chambers also approved moving the reimbursement proposal to the August runoff. These constitutional amendments did not simply happen to land on an election date associated with lower participation. Lawmakers affirmatively chose that date. The legislature did not merely choose the questions. It also chose an election likely to determine which audience would answer them. Oklahoma Watch reported that recent August runoff elections have generally attracted only about 10% to 12% of registered voters. This year's competitive Republican governor's runoff could increase participation, but the historical turnout figures show why the scheduling decision matters. If the historical turnout range were applied to Oklahoma's approximately 2,400,000 registered voters, statewide participation would amount to approximately 240,000 to 288,000 people. These figures illustrate the potential scale of the electorate. They are not a prediction for this particular election. A constitutional amendment approved by a simple majority under those historical turnout conditions could theoretically pass with approximately 120,000 to 145,000 affirmative votes. That would represent only about 5% to 6% of all registered Oklahoma voters. The partisan composition matters as well. Oklahoma Watch reported that the August ballot includes 4 Republican statewide runoff contests and only 1 Democratic statewide runoff. Republicans have multiple high-profile reasons to vote, including their party's nomination for governor. Many Democrats have fewer candidate contests attracting their attention, while independents cannot participate in either party's closed runoff. An independent voter who assumes the August election is only for party members may never realize that 2 constitutional amendments are also being decided. Every registered Oklahoma voter can vote on both state questions, regardless of party affiliation. You do not need a candidate in a runoff, and you do not have to be a Republican or Democrat. But legal eligibility is not the same as meaningful participation if voters do not know those questions are on the ballot. House Speaker Kyle Hilbert and Senate President Pro Tem Lonnie Paxton defended the August scheduling by saying they wanted to avoid overwhelming voters with too many questions during the general election. They characterized the decision as an effort to prevent ballot fatigue. At one point, numerous proposals were under consideration, but the Oklahoma State Election Board now lists only 2 questions on the August ballot and 2 on the November ballot. Whatever the original concerns may have been, the final election schedule hardly suggests that voters face an unmanageable number of statewide questions. Senate Democratic leader Julia Curt directly challenged efforts to schedule major constitutional proposals during the August runoff. She noted that independents are excluded from closed primaries and therefore have fewer reasons to participate. She argued that November is when everyone is included and that consequential statewide decisions should appear on the general election ballot. Amber England, who helped lead the campaign that placed Medicaid expansion in the Oklahoma Constitution, raised a similar objection. She argued that lawmakers believed fewer voters would improve their chances of controlling the outcome. Her criticism addressed the broader legislative scheduling strategy and does not establish the private motives of every legislator. Arnold Hamilton, editor of the Oklahoma Observer, examined the same issue in a column published by the Journal Record. He argued that legislative leaders attempted to place constitutional amendments before the state's smallest statewide electorate because doing so could improve the prospects for proposals expanding legislative power. These criticisms should not be confused with proof of criminal conduct or evidence that every lawmaker shared the same intention. They do demonstrate that concerns about the August scheduling were raised by elected officials, campaign leaders, investigative journalists, and experienced Oklahoma political commentators. The legislature's interest in the August ballot extended beyond the 2 questions that ultimately reached it. Lawmakers also attempted to move a proposed constitutional amendment involving Oklahoma's Judicial Nominating Commission from November to August. That proposal would change aspects of the commission responsible for helping select judicial candidates. Among other changes, it would eliminate existing restrictions limiting how many of the governor's appointees may belong to the same political party. In a state already dominated by one party, that is not an insignificant adjustment. Moving the judicial measure to August required a 2/3 vote. The Senate considered the scheduling provision twice. The first vote fell short at 27-17. The second failed at 29-15. Because neither vote reached the required threshold, the judicial proposal remained on the November ballot. The failed votes show that the scheduling dispute was not theoretical. lawmakers actively attempted to determine which electorate would consider important changes to Oklahoma's governing institutions. The fact that some Republicans joined Democrats demonstrates that concern about low-turnout constitutional elections was not confined to one political party. State Question 844 belongs directly in the discussion of Oklahoma's shadow budget because it concerns who ultimately pays for a manufacturing subsidy. The question involves the state's long-standing 5-year property tax exemption for qualifying manufacturers. In 1985, Oklahoma voters approved a 5-year property tax exemption intended to attract or expand manufacturing operations. Because property taxes support local services, the state also accepted responsibility for reimbursing communities for the revenue lost when a qualifying company receives the exemption. Property tax revenue supports public schools, county governments, career tech programs, libraries, health departments, and emergency services. The original bargain was straightforward. If Oklahoma decided to subsidize a manufacturer, the state would compensate the local institutions that otherwise would have collected the property taxes. State Question 844 would give the legislature authority to establish the levels and methods of reimbursement. Supporters argue the current arrangement requires reform because costs have exceeded the dedicated funding source and some counties receive a disproportionate share. Those are legitimate issues worthy of public debate. The proposed amendment does not tell voters what the new reimbursement formula would be. It does not identify which school districts or counties might receive less money. It does not guarantee full reimbursement or promise that money withheld from one community will be redirected to another school district. Speaker Hilbert has discussed the possibility that future reimbursement levels could vary. The manufacturer could still receive its tax exemption. The state could reduce its reimbursement. A local school district, county government, or career tech system could be left to absorb the difference. That would not necessarily make the subsidy less expensive. It could simply transfer part of the burden to local communities. Pryor Public Schools Superintendent Lisa Muller has pointed out that the amendment does not guarantee that money withheld from one district will be redirected to other schools. The proposal asks voters to trust future legislatures to make those decisions after the constitutional authority has already been transferred. For taxpayers trying to understand Oklahoma's shadow budget, the central issue is simple. If lawmakers want to provide an economic development incentive to a business, they should explain who will pay for it. They should not preserve the incentive while quietly shifting the financial responsibility to schools, local governments, and the families who depend on them. State Question 846 addresses a different subject but follows a similar pattern. It would place a voter identification requirement in the Oklahoma Constitution while giving the legislature authority to determine which forms of identification satisfy that requirement. At first glance, the proposal may sound like a straightforward effort to protect election integrity. But Oklahoma already requires voter identification. Voters approved the existing system in 2010, and the requirement took effect in 2011. Under current rules, voters generally can present qualifying government-issued identification or a voter identification card issued by election authorities. Absentee voting is also subject to established verification procedures. The question is not whether Oklahoma currently has voter identification. It already does. Supporters argue that placing the identification requirement in the Constitution would prevent a future legislature from eliminating it without another statewide vote. That is their stated justification, and it deserves to be acknowledged accurately. The amendment does not specify which forms of identification must remain acceptable. It does not guarantee that existing voter identification cards will continue to qualify, and it does not identify the future rules that might apply to absentee voting. Instead, it directs lawmakers to establish those requirements. The proposal would not automatically eliminate absentee voting or immediately impose a specific new restriction. Claiming otherwise would go beyond the available evidence. The legitimate concern is that it gives future legislatures considerable authority to define how a constitutional requirement applies to all authorized methods of voting. The Oklahoma Policy Institute criticized both state questions for the same underlying reason. Voters are being asked to approve constitutional changes before they know precisely how future lawmakers will implement them. One proposal concerns manufacturing subsidies. The other concerns voting rules. In both cases, the legislature receives broader authority while the public is asked to trust that the details will work out later. None of this means Oklahoma's earlier democratic establishment governed flawlessly. It did not. The historical lesson is that prolonged one-party control creates opportunities for insider relationships and weak public accountability, regardless of which party happens to dominate. The Oklahoma Historical Society describes a major county commissioner scandal involving approximately 220 commissioners and suppliers across roughly 60 counties. The scheme involved kickbacks on purchases of county road building materials, and federal investigators ultimately exposed the corruption. There is an important difference between that criminal scandal and current disputes over campaign contributions, lobbying, subsidies, and election scheduling. Campaign contributions, lobbying, and legislative disagreements do not by themselves establish bribery or illegal activity. But the institutional warning remains. When a political system becomes too entrenched, insiders can acquire more influence than the public. Transportation decisions show how political priorities can shape economic opportunity for generations. Oklahoma City benefits from Interstate 35, a direct north-south connection to the Dallas-Fort Worth economy. Tulsa does not have an equivalent direct interstate quality route into North Texas. The Indian Nation Turnpike, completed in sections between 1966 and 1970, runs from the Henrietta area through McAllister toward Hugo, with connections toward Paris, Texas. It serves southeastern Oklahoma but does not provide a direct limited-access corridor from Tulsa through Atoka and Durant into the Dallas-Fort Worth region. The historical record available does not establish that rural legislators deliberately blocked another route to protect traffic through their communities. Financing, engineering, and competing regional priorities may also have influenced the outcome. But the larger question remains legitimate. How much economic development did eastern Oklahoma lose because Tulsa never received a direct interstate quality connection to North Texas? The same concern applies to Oklahoma's expanding shadow budget. It includes tax credits, rebates, reduced tax rates, subsidies, designated set-asides, and related financial commitments that shape public spending outside the ordinary appropriations process. Our review places an earlier collection of these commitments at roughly $180 million to $200 million. A broader projection for fiscal year 2027 approaches $1,500 million. That projection combines reported costs, statutory caps, and designated contributions. It is not an audited accounting of every dollar actually spent. Nevertheless, the overall direction is unmistakable. Financial commitments that once measured in the hundreds of millions now approach $1.5 billion. Oklahoma did not refuse to use government to shape the economy. It chose to shape the economy through subsidies, tax preferences, and financial commitments that often receive less scrutiny than the annual appropriations bill. A tax credit is still a public decision about who receives a benefit and who absorbs the cost. The beneficiaries of these programs usually know when relevant legislation is moving. They can hire lobbyists, contact lawmakers, attend hearings, and support candidates aligned with their priorities. Most families do not have a paid representative at the Capitol asking whether an incentive raises wages, improves household incomes, or produces enough public benefit to justify its cost. Senator Dave Rader's Senate Bill 1403 provides a useful example of how these pressures can play out inside a government dominated by one party. The original Senate proposal included accountability provisions reflecting recommendations from Oklahoma's Incentive Evaluation Commission. Among other requirements, new applications would have been subject to county average wage standards. Businesses also would have faced a deadline for submitting an initial rebate claim. The central premise was hardly radical. If taxpayers are subsidizing economic development, the jobs being subsidized should meet a meaningful wage standard. The measure passed a Senate committee unanimously and then cleared the full Senate by a vote of 32 to 15. Republican senators had approved a proposal intended to place reasonable conditions on public economic development incentives. The legislation changed after reaching the House. The House version removed the principal safeguards and expanded the industries eligible for benefits. The Department of Commerce and other participants were involved in discussions surrounding the rewrite. The revised bill ultimately died without final Senate approval, meaning the expanded proposal did not become law. But the process remains instructive. A measure introduced to strengthen accountability was transformed into one that weakened its original conditions, while the public received no clear accounting of what the rewrite might cost or save. The disagreement did not result from a change in partisan control. It occurred within a political system already dominated by Republicans. When the same party controls the House, the Senate, and the governor's office, consequential struggles often take place between competing interests inside the dominant coalition. Taxpayers must ask who has the greater access. Oklahoma's participation problem extends beyond the primary season. In the 2024 presidential election, approximately 53% of eligible Oklahoma voters participated, compared with a national average of roughly 64%. Under that eligible voter measure, Oklahoma ranked last nationally. The 53% presidential election figure includes all eligible voters, whether registered or not. The 26% figure from the June primary measures registered voters. They use different calculations, but both reveal the same problem. Oklahoma's electorate becomes smaller precisely when important political decisions are being made. The point is not that Democrats would automatically govern better. Oklahoma's history offers reasons to reject that argument. The point is that prolonged one-party control creates predictable incentives, regardless of which party holds power. Low turnout primaries narrow the audience politicians must satisfy, while organized interests understand the rules and participate consistently. The result does not have to be criminal corruption. It can be something quieter and more persistent. A government increasingly responsive to the people with access and increasingly distant from the families paying the bills. The central question is not whether Oklahoma still holds elections. It is whose interests those elections ultimately serve. Before August 25th, every registered Oklahoman should understand that the two state questions are not reserved for Republicans, Democrats, or voters with a candidate in a runoff. Every registered Oklahoma voter can vote on state questions 844 and 846. When I arrived in Oklahoma, one party controlled nearly everything. Nearly half a century later, another party does. The names and campaign signs changed, but the structural problem remains. If the legislature chose the audience, Oklahoma voters still have the power to change who shows up. Read more at wlangdon.substack.com.